Wish me luck on the reading and wish me luck on enunciating things. Like Palmares. What is Palmares? Palmares. Whatever. We're going to find out right away. Right. Let's see if it did it. Effects. So that's not it. The largest and longest lasting autonomous republic of escaped slaves in colonial Brazil. Interesting. That's good. All right. And the other one is Mirage. Huh? What?
Look on the screen.
Oh, hey, look, it's our front door. Look at that. There you go. Is that better?
All right, I have to leave the room because there's refrigerant leaking out of our fridge. So I'm going to not be available to you for a little bit.
All right. Here we go, everybody. In Brazil, which we have seen dominated the Portuguese slave trade, the Maroon settlements that began in the 16th century would extend into the next. Ernesto Enes, a scholar who was far from being in sympathy with the fugitives, nevertheless recorded in 1948 from his review of the documents in the Arquivo Histórico Colonial in Lisbon that he found, quote, traces in every corner of Brazil of Quilambos, which is the Maroon settlements. Arthur Romas, summarizing his own studies of black people in Brazil, declared, from the beginning of slavery, escapes were frequent. The escaped slaves, called locally Quilambolas, often gathered together in organized groups known in Brazil as Quilambos. From the beginning, the owners complained of the frequent escapes of the slaves, demanding protection and security for the public from the public authorities. Later, the situation was met by the employment of the bush captain, and by notice in the press, politicizing the loss of the slaves and urging collective action for their recapture. That the slaves had good reasons to be concerned for their liberty, despite bland suggestions from scholars like A.J.R. Russell Wood that the only thing at issue was their, quote, adapting to the new diet, new environment, and new working conditions, end quote, is suggested by Stuart Schultzworth's consideration of the sugar industry in colonial Bahia, added to the rigors inherent in the system of sugar production and to the occasional acts of individual cruelty. Slaves also suffered from a planned policy of punishment and terror as a means of control. Plantation owners believed that only by severity could work be accomplished and discipline maintained, especially when the ratio in the fields was often 40 slaves to 1 white sharecropper or overseer. This sort of institutionalized brutality, when coupled with arduous labor power, working conditions, and simply cruelty, distributed to be motivation for escape. The work of Ramos, K.R. Kent, Irene Diggs, Donald Pearson, Edison Cornero, Schultz, and Raimundo Nainin Rodriguez indicates that for Brazil as a whole, from the 16th century into the late 19th century, Slave resistance, rebellions, and conspiracies were constant in that land. In the 17th and 19th century, though, it was the maroon settlements that dominated the reaction of slavery. In the, here we go, the Pernambuco region, the greatest settlement of all, the extraordinary state of Palmares, would endure from 1605 to 1695. Palmares was a plural designating the several settlements, Palmares, and that made up a community which, though necessarily agrarian, was even more preoccupied with its defense. Diggs gives us this description. The site of the Qualambo of O.C. Palmares was the mountainous region steeped with precipitous and natural defense of the inhabitants, but at the same time, the virgin land, whose exuberance was considered the best in the state of Pernambuco. The many fruit trees gave easy assistance to those who knew where they were. Timber yielding trees served various industrial uses. Most important of all trees was the Palmera pindobo, the coconut palm, which provided excellent food and a delicious drink. In 1645, Bartholomew Linz acting as a scout for the expedition that the Dutch were to mount against the Palmares, was the first hostile European to discover that the state consisted of several settlements, 2 major Palmares, and 5,000 inhabitants, the several small units totaling 6,000. By 1677, there were 10 major Palmares, one of which was the capital of Makoko, there where the king, here we go, Genga Zamba from the Zandia signified census ruler, resided the whole state spanning over 60 leagues. It was then estimated that the population numbered between 15,000 and 20,000, a mixture of Creoles and Africans, largely drawn from the Angola-Congo region. For almost a century, neither the Portuguese nor the interlopers, Dutch, nor the Creoles, Moradors, could destroy it, though they tried for more than 70 years, even in the end. Between 1672 and 94, end quote, R.K. Kent tells us, quote, it withstood on the average 1 Portuguese expedition every 15 months. There was, however, one important political development during this period. In 1678, quote, as he had done earlier, whenever a new governor came to Pernambuco, Gangan Zambi sued for peace, end quote. The treaty that was eventually signed, Kent quotes Nina Rodriguez, quote, gave a real importance to black people, to the black state, which now the colonial treaty, as one nation would another. The treaty, however, had little import for the Moradors, I can't say it, who proceeded to claim and distribute among themselves a substantial portion of the black state. Ganga Zamba's authority was breached. By 1679, the Palmarastia captain named Zambi, whose uncle is Gangazona, was in revolt with Juan Melto. Kanghange, Gaspar, and Armirio, having done the person of Gangazamba to death. By March 1680, Zambia was being called upon to surrender without success. The war was on once more. Zumbia, according to Ramos, quote, was already a well-known chief whose deeds amazed even the white soldiery. He would apparently reign as king in New Palmares, Palmares, until its end almost 2 decades later. But in his accession to authority, it is possible to recognize that Ramos and the others have described as the Bantu origins of Palmares. And here's my first restriction, everybody. Okay, thank you. The perception of authentic authority as identical with secure social integrity was characteristically called Central Africa. Palmeiras did fall eventually in 1694, the result of the campaigns launched by successive Portuguese government of Pernambuco, João de Canhon, Scatu, Mayor Marquez de Montebello, and Melo de Castro. The last expedition sent against it consisted of nearly 3,000 men and was in the field for several months. And the final siege was established on 10th of November, 1693, and lasted until early February of the following year. The total cost of the adventure was estimated by Melo de Castro as somewhere near 1,400,000 cruzados. On the night of February 5th, 1694, Zambi, organizer of the defense of Palmares, having discovered that his position on, Baragan Mountains had been nearly encircled, sought a last desperate chance to escape. The result was described by Colonel Domingos Jorge Vejo, a leader of the Portuguese forces. And here's what he says. During the second watch of the night between the 5th and the 6th of February, suddenly tumultuously Zambi, with all his people and the equipment which could follow him through the space, made an exit. The sentinels of that post did not perceive them almost until the end. In the rear guard, Zambi himself was leaving, and at that point, he was shot twice. As it was dark, and all this was taking place at the edge of the cliff, matter of about, of course, I don't care, stop improving it then. Matter of about 200 fell down the cliff. As many others were killed of other sexes and all ages. 519 were taken prisoners. In Pernambuco, can't say the word, again, according to the governor Melo de Castro, quote, this happy victory was regarded as no less important than the expulsion of the Dutch. It was accordingly celebrated by the whole population with displays of lights for 6 days and many other demonstrations of joy, without any command being given to them. Keep in character, Enos attributed this excitement to the moral influence which it conferred on the authorities. Palmares, Ramos reminds us, was not, however, the only outstanding case. In 1650, the slaves of Rio de Janeiro organized a number of quilombos, which caused the police authorities of that region untold difficulties. Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm back. What page are we on?
216.
216. All right, thank you.
Which caused the police authorities of that region untold difficulties until suppressed by Captain Manuel Jordo de Silva. In this same century, the 17th century, the slaves of Jamaica joined the tradition of those in Brazil and Mexico. Barbara Kopetoff has summarized the conditions. During the era of slavery, communities of Maroons, or escaped slaves, sprang up throughout the New World. Wherever they were slave plantations, there was resistance in the form of runaways and slave revolts. And wherever mountains, swamps, or forests permitted the escaped slaves to gather, they formed communities. These ranged in size from Palmeiras to Brazil, with over 10,000 people, to the handfuls of runaways who hid in the fringes of plantations in the American South. While most were destroyed, a few could be reduced or even contained. In mid-century, exploded with revolts on that island in 1669, 1672 twice, 1668, 1682, 1685, and 1690. In Jamaica, Maroonage had begun during the period of Spanish colonization, 1509 to 1655, and in the very last years of Spanish resistance, 1655 to 1660, the British occupation of the island. At least 3 Maroon camps played decisive roles in supporting the guerrilla campaign led by Cristobal de Yassi against the British. In the first month of 1660, however, the English made peace with one of the Maroon chiefs, Juan de Bule, who promptly went to aid them in the destruction of, first, the remaining major Maroon camps, and finally, Yassa's guerrillas. A little more than 3 years later, Juan de Bule met his appropriate fate. What reads like an official entry observed, quote, on the first day of November, the outlining black person met with Juan de Bule and cut him to pieces, else all things were quite in the country. 300 years later, with the equal amount of sympathy, David Besseret and S.A.G. Taylor unhesitantly estimated, quote, his death seemed to us an act of justice. He was, quote, the great traitor. During the next 80 years, 2 major Maroon societies were formed in the highlands of Jamaica. One, the Windward Maroons, settling in the eastern mountains, had as its nucleus the Spanish Maroons and those who subsequently joined them from the English plantation and towns. The other, the Leeward Maroons of the west central interior, came into being in 1673 after the first of the slave rebellions during the English period. In 1690, another major rebellion began in the Sutton estate, added more than 200 refugees to the Leeward settlements complex. Such was the primary fashion on which the settlements grew and maintained themselves. The Maroon societies were formed and their numbers increased, largely by slave rebellions and by individuals and groups escapes from the plantation. In addition, slaves were captured by Maroons during raids, and slaves or free black people sent to fight the Maroons occasionally defected. Rebellions furnished the largest number, as many as several hundred at a time. But the rebellion were only one of the number of occasions of escape. There was a steady trickle of runaways. The trickle became a stream whenever English punitive expeditions failed of their purpose. Apparently, too, because of the low ratio of women to men, the Maroon communities were not yet self-reproducing. Though Akan speakers seem to have been dominant among these Jamaican Maroons, the political structure of the Leeward Maroons closely followed that found among the more Central African Palmeiristia in Brazil. Cujo, who became a dominant Leeward Maroon chieftain in the 1730s, employed a paramilitary organization that combined central authority with decentral settlements. Hello. On the other hand, Kaptoff notes, quote, by the 1730s, the Maroons in the East had coalesced into a kind of cooperative federation. In contrast, one clear distinction, though, between the Jamaican and the Brazilian black people was the presence of OBEH men and women, magical practitioners, among the wayward and leeward Maroons. To the masters, OBEH, obey, was simply witchcraft, detested both for its secrecy and its alleged skills in the poisoning of enemies. Even black people once assimilated Ohe assumed the sinister aurora because of its association with the cast of spells to cause harm as well as good. To the unassimilated, on the other hand, Ohe was both a genuine religion and a potent source of medicine. ABEHO, like the Haitian voodoo or the Jamaican variant of Maoism and Trinidadian Shango, sought ritualistic links with the world beyond the shadows and the scared trees, providing the mystical sense of continuity between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. The Palmers, in keeping with the cosmologies of Congolese and Angolan societies, magicians had been banned as inimical to king's authority. Among those peoples, it was most often the case that legitimacy of authority and the very existence of social order were concomitants to the eradication of sorcery and witchcraft. In the British Caribbean, the elimination of Oboe had become an official preoccupation, and for a good reason. Oboe men and women were frequently the source of ideology for the slave rebellion. Oboe functioned largely in the numerous rebellions of the slaves. This was particularly the case with the Oboean men from the Gold Coast. In the plotting of these rebellions, the Oboe men was essential in administering oaths and secrecy. In cases distributing fetishes which were supposed to immunize the insurgents from the arms of the whites. As it happened, Oboe proved to be more resilient than its opponent. Indeed, it was never extinguished. It continued its mutational adaptation and development in Jamaica and elsewhere over the centuries, successively manifesting itself in the societies of Maoism in the 18th and 19th century, the Pocomania movement of the late 19th, and the Rastafarians of the present. We shall see. As it was with Oboe, it was also the case with Maroonage. Returning to the 17th century, the Palquins, the Macambos, the Qualambos, and Maroon settlements that found sometimes tenuous, sometimes permanent existence in Mexico, Brazil, and Jamaica were replicated throughout the Spanish territories and the newer colonial possessions, making the expansions of British, French, and Dutch merchants, agrarian, and bureaucratic interests. In Colombia, near the city of Cartagena, a Pelecu, known as San Viascioli, sorry everybody, by Silvio, was founded at the beginning of the century. Earlier, in 1529 to 1550, revolts had occurred on the coast of this largely gold, sugar, and cocoa producing colony. But as the extractive industries moved further into the interior, and Colombia's demand for labor had made it a major importer of Africans, 200,000 revolts and the establishment of refugee settlements became more frequent. Nevertheless, the Aguiles El Sentia tells us the most vigorous insurrectionist movement in the Caribbean coast of Colombia occurred in Cartagena de Indias at the beginning of the 17th century during the administration of Geronimo de Sanzo Casarola. The fiery and daring Domingo Boyojo, who was the first slave to revolt publicly, claiming to have been king of an African state. He plunged himself with 30 black men and women into the forests and the marshy areas of Mutana, south of the town of Tulu. Domingo, now known as King Bencos, put an end to the period of colonial tranquility in Cartagena, Tulu, Mampos, Tenerife, and so forth by assaulting and robbing plantations, cattle ranches, cultivated farms, even canoes carrying fellow black people who had been sent to fell large trees for lumber. Numerous expeditions against San Basilio failed, and in 1612 and 1613, a treaty that concluded amnesty was offered by the governor Diego Fernandez del Valesquio. Many of the Palacueneros attempted the terms, which included the abandonment of the settlement. But in 1619, when other major slave revolts occurred in Cartagena, mountains of the occasion was seized by a subsequent governor to met out what he took to be a too long deferred revenge on the ex-rebels. Escalante, however, quote, Governor Garcia Gurdon uncovered a new plot by Bencos and captured him, and finally he had him hanged. Still, descendants of the San Basilio Palanquin were to be encountered in the hinterlands as late as 1790. Not until the very last years of the 17th century, 1696, did the last of the period's major slave rebellions in Colombia take place. In Venezuela, the settlement of Nicaragua, which Baron de Humboldt, apparently with some cynicism, referred to as the Republic of Zambos and biracial peoples, was founded in the similar circumstances in 1601. As such, it was in the direct line of descent from the rebellions that began in the colony in 1532 and again in 1555 with the establishment of Bura Panloquin associated with King Miguel. Venezuela, whose economy was a close replica of that of Colombia, would historically absorb a little more than half the number of slaves, 121,000. However, for almost 300 years, Venezuela's Spanish settlements would have visited upon them the combined vengeance of black people, biracial people, indigenous people, and Zambos in its highlands and valleys, which became the site for rebellion Cumbus, CUMBS, the social basis of liberation movements became increasingly miscongenious. I'm going to look up this word, everybody. Go back. Of course, it won't let me hear it, so I have to show it. It's not there, is it? Nope, not there. Okay. All right, so that's the word. Can't say it. Misogynous, maybe. An adjective describing the relationship, marriage, or offsprings involve people of different races. Okay. That's what that supposedly means. There it is. All right. After the 17th century, the same could be said of the towns that developed in close proximation to its ports and inland markets. In the countryside, the farming peasantry became anarchic. As far as is known, no vision of an African state was ever associated with the flights or rebellions recorded in Venezuela. In the towns, something more akin to class war became the rule, putting free black people, slaves, poor whites, biracial people, and Zambos, and sometimes indigenous, against the Spanish ruling class. Perhaps another consequence of oh my gosh, another word.
Deracination?
Deracination. Oh, let's find out what that means. Do the ad thing. They had it simply different. To act and pulling up of the roots, uprooting, forcibly displacing someone from their native environment, culture, or traditions. Okay. Of black people and indigenous people was that in the 18th and 19th centuries, Venezuela obtained a level of violence in its rebellions and reaction that was barely matched elsewhere in the slave society. Finally, in the British and French Guianas of Dutch surname, there occurred the most extraordinary instances of maroonage, the formation of what in the literary is rightly referred to as the bush black tribes. They use the N-word. These people, the Samarica, the Matawa, the Quanita, and the Dajuka, the Aluka, and the Paramaka constituted most enduring and oldest examples of continuous maroonage. They are the people who, in the instance of Suriname, could be quite until quite recently in the century described as a constituting, quote, a state within a state. Their history too begins in the 17th century, somewhere near the second quarter. Richard Price, one of the best informed students of these communities, has observed, for some 300 years, the Guianas have been the classic setting for maroon communities, though local maroons in French and British Guiana were wiped out by the end of the 18th century. The Maroons of Suriname, known as Bush black people, as they use the N-word, have long been the hemisphere's largest Maroon population, except perhaps for Haiti. This have been the most highly developed independent societies and cultures in the history of Afro-America. Though the ancestries of these people are to be traced to the windward gold and slave coasts of and to Luango/Angola, they have fought and achieved a new identity, Bush black people. They use the N-word. That past demands attention. The conditions that produced the Maroon communities and ultimately the genesis of new peoples in the Guianas and Suriname were a product of a slave system of extremists. Its most important characteristic was that for African labor, Suriname became the most lethal colony in the New World. As Price remarks, quote, "The most striking feature of Suriname's demographic history is the extraordinary cost of its slave system in human lives." And A.D. Simmons exclaims, "We have seen some plantations swallow as many as 4 slave complements in a period of 25 years." End quote. The Dutch Caribbean companies and their successors were hard pressed to supply and resupply the colonial needs for fresh African workers. Suriname's laboring population then was constantly being revitalized biologically and, as it turns out, culturally. In the colony where the ratio of black people to whites came as high as 25-1 in the 18th century, and those populations maintained fewer than 10% Creoles for the first century. Their labor was concentrated on large sugar, coffee, cocoa, and even cotton plantations. Price seemed entirely justified in asserting that inter-Africa syncretism, I can't say it, syncretism was almost everywhere and the central process. We can assert with some confidence that within the earliest decades of the African presence in Suriname, the core of the new language and a new religion had been developed, and the subsequent centuries of mass new importations from Africa apparently had the effect merely of leading to secondary elaborations. It was not long before the rainforest that boldly defined the limits of cultivable land became the bounds of the resistance of an entirely different sort. Maroonage, of course, was the concomitant of slavery. Brutality was as much a raison d'etre of the former as it was a condition of the latter. The English colonization of Suriname was a short duration, 1651 to 67. But even before the Dutch invasion of the colonial and the Treaty of Breda, 1667, which formally succeeded it to them, Maroons had appeared. By the beginning of the 18th century, the Maroon population was estimated to have reached 5,000 to 6,000. Clearly an inflated figure, but indicative of the fear in which the colonialists held the rebels. Extraordinary rewards were posted for the hunters of the liberationists. But even more remarkable are the rewards that became customary for the Maroons. Price cities, and earlier 1760 contemporary reports in a slave runs away into the forest in order to evade work for a few weeks. Upon his being captured, his Achilles tendon is removed for the first offense. While for the second offense, if he wishes to increase the punishment, His right leg is amputated in the order to stop him from running away. I myself was a witness to slaves being punished this. Others were whipped to death with what was called the Sanasi Bok, Spanish whip, or quartered alive, burned alive, decapitated, impaled with a meat hook, or broken of scaffolds. Price argues that the multiplicity of the travelers' accounts, the local reports attesting to the unusual brutality of the surnamed planters of both Dutch and Portuguese Jewish origins fully substantiate that such practices were neither isolated nor unofficial. Quote, the colonial judiciary was often as brutal as the individual planters. The reports of the English mercenary Captain J.G. Stedman narrative of a 5 years expedition against the revolted black people of Suriname in Guyana on the wild coast of South America from the year 1772 to 1777. 1796 is a classic of authentic accounts of the starkly brutal slave society. Price concludes, in all, the excess of colonial Suriname, in terms of both the brutality and the luxury aimed which the planters lived, most must be consistently kept in the mind in building towards some understanding of the slave's response. Thus for the beginning of the bush black people of that land, the oldest being Saramaka people. And at the end of the 18th century, after more than 5 decades of intensive warfare, they achieved a formal peace. But perhaps the last word should be from one of their own. In 1885, Johannes King recalled from the oral traditions of his people the story of how our forefathers honored God and their nearly early ancestors when they came to receive the presents presented by the government to the bush black people as confirmation of peace treaties, and then returned to their villages. When they got back safely to their villages, they fired many salutes for the people who had waited at home. These people came to the bank of the river, singing to escort them to shore. They played drums, danced, blew African trumpets, and sang, danced, and celebrated on the whole afternoon until nighttime, and the whole night until morning. And they played drums. So when they were finished, they would bring a bush drink that they made from sugarcane juice, and which it was called bush rum. They would pour a libation on the ground. Yeah, okay. It was in order to give thanks to God and the ancestors. After that, they would play for the Awihans and others, and for the other gods who would help them fight. The struggle had begun in the 17th century and had met its fruition among these African peoples, far from the land of their ancestors. Any questions? All right, no questions. All right, Black resistance in North America. Here we go. We're moving on to North America. So far, we might have to go back and back. They're going to mention other places. All right. And so the litany.
Yeah.
Okay. Of rebellions and maroonage continued into the 18th century. In the Guianas and Berbers, Condobo, and Demerara in the 1730s, and in 1760s in Jamaica, in the 1780s in Cuba, in the 1780s in Venezuela, in the 1730s and 1780s. As the capitalist strata of the Western Europe achieved political, social, and ideological maturity, their jockeying for hegemony over the world system reduced African labor in its homelands and in the New World peripheries to pawns of power. State banditry, as E.P. Thompson named it, became the modus operandi that weeded out the landed nobilities and integrated their survivors with the rising bourgeoisie. And intensive exploitation of labor became the basis of purchasing new sorts of intra-European domination. In the overseas territories in the slave societies of Cuba, Brazil, North America, Jamaica, and Haiti, restive colonial elites amassed wealth, but envisioned how much greater and diverse that wealth could become without the parasitism and restraints of the state and trade imposed by the dominant orders in the mother countries. For these ruling elites to enslaved African labor, that it is super exploitation become a key to their liberation. All whether landed nobility, landed colonialists, or the masters of long-distance trade believed the brutality of the slave system to be a practical necessity. Maroon settlements like those of Jamaica, Cuba, and North America had to be destroyed, failing that, quarantined. They could not be allowed to contaminate a labor upon which so much deepened. Frequently for the masters, however, it did not seem to matter. Who then resisted slavery in the 18th century? The records concerning armed revolt indicated that it was mainly African-born, including male and female, young and old, plantation slaves and urban slaves. These emphasis on the African-born may have been for a simple reason that Africans outnumbered the Creoles, owing to the low birth rates on the plantations and the heavy importations of Africans. Wars of repression then still had to be undertaken. Several disciplines maintained. Even then, the master's nightmare kept reoccurring, and their wildness periodically assumed epidemic proportions. As Christians, it might be added, they were possessed by the mythology of apocalypse too easily, converting into frightening visions. At every opportunity, as Joshua Giddings' Tales of Florida reminds us, the logic of maroonage was manifest. The efforts of the Carolinians to enslave the indigenous peoples brought with them the natural and appropriate penalties. The indigenous people soon began to make their escape from service to the indigenous country. This example was soon followed by African slaves, who also fled to the indigenous country, and in order to secure themselves from pursuit, continued their journey into Florida. We are unable to fix the precise time when the person thus exiled constituted a separate community. Their numbers had become so great in 1736 that they were formed into companies and relied on by the Floridians as allies to aid in the defense of that territory. They were also permitted to occupy land upon the same terms that were granted to the citizens of Spain. Indeed, they in all respects became free subjects of the Spanish crown. In North America, the maroon communities of the mid-century in Florida, Virginia, and the Carolinas were anticipated by the slave revolt in New York City in 1712, and that of Stono, South Carolina, in 1739. In the final 70 years of the century, Gerald Mullen found the Virginia newspaper along advertisements for nearly 1,500 fugitives from slavery. Colonial North America was particularly vulnerable to slave liberation movements in those regions where black people made up the majority. At the century's beginning, South Carolina and the eastern countries of Virginia were two such areas. And in earlier 18th century, when South Carolina's African population was being hastily enlarged at a rate in the 1730s of more than 1,000 per year, according to Peter Wood, as a concomitant of the colony's growing domination by rice production. Harvey Wishes writes that, quote, the plantation system had yielded bummer crops of slave uprisings and revolts, end quote. The 1713, 1720, 1730s, and the 1740s, conspiracies of actual rebellions were routinely reported to London. From the early 1780s, the black liberationists were further encouraged by the actions of the Spanish king, Philip V, who authorized granting them liberty once they reached Florida. In 1739, when 69 slaves escaped to St. Augustine, they were settled at Pueblo del Garcia, Rio de Santi, Torres de Mos, or Moose, 2.5 miles north of the city 10 months later. In September 1739, South Carolina was shaken by an incident which became known as the Stono Uprising. A group of slaves struck a violent but abortive blow for liberation, which resulted in the deaths of more than 60 people. Fewer than 25 white lives were taken, and property damage was localized. By the episode represented a new dimension in the overt resistance. Free colonialists, whose anxieties about controlling slaves had been growing for some time, saw their fears of open violence realized, and this, in turn, generated new fears. It was several months before the officials of the colony were satisfied that the Stono Rebellion was over. By then, however, the second conspiracy in June 1740 demanded their attention. Reports of the official reaction to Maroons continued into the 1740s, but with the formation of Georgia as a colony free of black slavery until 1750, the southern route to liberty became more hazardous, both for the slaves and the Georgian colonialists who sought to impede them. Still, Henry Lawrence, quote, distinguished natives, end quote, had cause to note in the letter dated March 21st, 1748, quote, as most horrid insurrection in the colony. The colonial Virginia trials of black rebels began to dot the country's records as early as late 17th century. Seldom very expansive, the records of the period most often reflected official fastidiousness. In James City,
I said yes.
Yeah. In James City County on May 30th, 1688, or, for example, the disposition of a case remanded from Westmoreland County early 26th of April was concluded by, the general court. Quote, it appeared that Sam, a black person, servant to Richard Metcalf, hath several times endeavored to promote a black insurrection in this colony, end quote. We shall never know that what this man said to his accusers, his reasons, or his achievements. We do not know that Sam was ordered to be whipped around the town and fitted with an iron collar. What?
We do know. You said we do not.
We do know that Sam was ordered to be. Oh, sorry. I was just going to repeat it. We do know that Sam was ordered to be whipped around the town and fitted with an iron collar with 4 sprigs that he was to wear until his death. It was hoped that this would deter him and others from the evil practice for time to come. End quote. Just how effective the general court's punishment was can perhaps be judged by the fact that in the countries of Survey Isle, of Wright, James City, Middlesex, and Gloucester, several plots involving first indigenous and black people, and then black people separately, were discovered in 1709, 1722, and 1723. And in 1727, a maroon community of indigenous and black people, oh my gosh, which it inhabits, called Des Natapelli, was betrayed by a former resident. Further maroonage in Virginia and neighboring Maryland had been reported by Alan Kulukoff. I gotta appeal another one. Woohoo! That's gonna say, and the next thing he's gonna do is gonna be like, you have failed. If you Africans formed communities in the wilderness in 1720s, then black immigration was high and the frontier close to tidewater. At least two outlining runaway communities were established during the 1720s. 15 slaves began a settlement in 1729 on the frontier near present-day Lexington, Virginia. They ran from, quote, a new plantation on the head of James River, taking tools, arms, clothing, and food with them. When captured, quote, they had already begun to clear the ground. Another small community evidently developed on the Maryland frontier in 1728 and 1729. Harry, one of the runaways, returned to southern Prince George. See, it says not approved. Okay, you don't have to tell me it's not approved. County to report on the place of his former shipmates. He told them that, quote, there are many black people among the indigenous at Monocozy, end quote, and tried to entice them to join the group by claiming that indigenous people were soon going to attack the whites. But the history of maroonage of colonial Virginia is still far from complete. In the period 1718 to 69, during which Philip Curtin calculates the proportion of Africans brought directly to the colony increased, the absence of the mention of maroonage in the 1750s and 80s years seem odd. This is particularly the case when Gerald Mullen informs us advertised runaways, quote unquote, were prominent. 12% of them being described as African born or outlandish, quote unquote. And a third of the fugitives were thought by their masters to be headed to inland North Carolina. Nevertheless, there is evidence of such communities in the late 18th century, 1781, in what was by then a commonwealth, as well as a reference to maroon communities having been established in areas of South Carolina, 1765, and Georgia, 1771, 1772, 1780s, in the colonial and post-colonial periods. Again, it was precisely in those places where black people constituted a substantial proportion of their population. North Carolina, where the 1790 census put the slave population at 26.8%, Maryland 37.7%, Georgia 35.9%, Virginia 40.9%, South Carolina 43.7%. That the available records indicated rebellions and maroon activity as almost likely to occur. Moreover, it was precisely that black population that demonstrated in the century's 8 decades the capacity to respond to British overtures during the American Rebellion and to the presence of British troops and propaganda Jack Foner writes, at the very time that the American Army ended the practice of recruiting black people, the British adopted it, hoping in this way to overcome their acute manpower shortage, to cripple the rebellious colonies economically by inducing slaves to desert their rebel masters and seek refuge within the British lines, and to convince black people by offering them liberty in exchange for military service, that their freedom depended on the success of British arms. Again, you. Nonetheless, as Geoffrey Crowe cautioned, the slaves' response to the machination of the British General Thomas Gage and Lord Dunmore, governor of colonial Virginia, had its independent context, but the slave unrest that accompanied the open stages of the war was too widespread to have been the work of a single British conspiracy. Though royal governors and military observers had often commented on the potential for the massive slave insurrection in the southern colonies, from the Chesapeake to the Georgia coast, black insurgents sprang into action even before the British tendered themselves their help. Rebellious slaves had always been attentive to the crises among their exploiters and any monetary advantage, whether it be a master's absence for a few days, the French Indigenous Wars, or the Nationalist Rebellion, was likely to be seized. And on those rare occasions when the slaves perceived the appearance of a powerful ally, as with the British during the 1770s, the consequences could be dramatic. Contemporary estimated that the South lost as many as 15,000 bondsmen. Crowe suggests many evacuate. What?
55,000.
Thank you. Crowe suggested many evacuated with the British or were emancipated. Others simply attempted to pass as free black people. By 1775, the leaders of the Continental Army had been compelled to compete with the British authorities for black people, both for their efforts on land and sea. And though some fractions of the ruling class continued to resist the enlargement of slave soldiery, notably the state legislators of Georgia and South Carolina, in the end, more black people were enlisted as combatants by the nationalists than by their British opponents. After the war, however, the British military proved to be the more faithful ally of the slave soldiers. Not surprisingly then, in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Virginia, in 1780s and the 1790s were times of rebellion in the young republic. Black assertiveness, I don't know this word.
Assertiveness.
Yeah, black assertiveness in the post-war North Carolina revealed a greater collective consciousness among slaves and an increasing willingness to use violence to liberate not only individuals but groups of slaves. In 1783, the Chauvin County Court tried the slave Greninji from the atrocious crime of endeavoring to stir up slaves for the diabolical purpose of murdering their masters and mistresses. End quote. In the summer of 1795, Wilmington suffered sporadic attacks by a number of runaway black people who, in the daytime, secret themselves in the swamp. Secret themselves in the swamps and woods, and at night commit various depredations on the neighboring plantations. What?
I think you got it.
Okay, cool. Sorry, it's like you sometimes just like I can't hear you. That's why I say what. In Bertie County in 1798, 3 black men were accused of heading a conspiracy of 150 slaves armed with guns and clubs, swords and knives. And it was not only the slaves who were dissatisfied with the political issues of the rebellion. During the waning months of the war, whites joined them in attacks on the plantation in Virginia's Gotchkin land and city, formerly King George's counties. Any questions?
Okay. Well, no, but I want to remark on some of the stuff we read. So, this is really interesting, and this is really thought-provoking for a lot of people that maybe aren't thinking about it. But we're not taught much about rebellions, are we? We're taught like the one. I forgot his name, but we're taught like one, and we're not taught anymore. And then to hear rebellion after rebellion after rebellion after rebellion happen is thought-provoking.
So, Haitian Revolution. Quick brief one on this. The 18th century ended with the moment. Let's see, we're good. The 18th century ended with a movement of slaves to match the drama of Brazil's Palomares and the significance of the maroon settlements in Jamaica and Suriname during the preceding century. In Haiti, between 1791 and 1804, slave armies managed to defeat the French, Spanish, and English militaries, the most sophisticated army of the day. Haiti thus became the second new world colony to achieve political independence from its European masters, and the first slave society to achieve the permanent destruction of a slave system. Modern Haiti constituted the western third of the island of the 16th century. Spaniards had known as Hispaniola. Its earlier history during the Spanish occupation has already been rehearsed here. Having largely eliminated its native inhabitants and leached its sources of precious metals, and conquistadors quickly moved on. With the depopulation of Hispaniola and the complete domination of Spain's New World economy by the mines and plantations of Nueva España and Colombia, after the mid-16th century, the island retreated to the more remote pages of history. Only the eastern regions retained any substantial remnant of its colonial population, while as O.T. Otto, in slight, oh my gosh, where are all these hair? Go away. In slight imitation of the poetic form Lilith's. Quote, the only inhabitants on the western part of the island were the roving herds of cattle and swine, which had escaped the Spanish. End quote. In the 17th century, the western regions of what the French called Saint Domingo acquired some settlements based on the activities of renegade seamen and pirates from Tortuga, attracted initially by the supply of meat in the region, and then subsequently encouraged the French colonial authorities, one of which Bertrand d'Orgeron imported women from Paris in the 1660s. The buccaneers, named for their diet of almost burnt meat, gradually transformed into planters, just as gradually their French settlements in western Hispaniola reintroduced a slave system. The census of 1681 recorded a slave population of 2,000, and that of 1687 one of 3,400. But after the Treaty of Ryswick, 1697, in which Spain officially recognized French Saint Domingo, and Louis, that is the 24th, restricted the buccaneers' plunder. to slaves, the black population increased rather rapidly. By 1701, the official memoir disdained for the Minister of Marine estimated the slave population at 20,000. And in 1754, a similar document put that figure then at 230,000. Hey, Carrot. On the eve of the revolution, the slave population was estimated to be between 450,000 to 509,000. The white population 30,000, and the biracial population. French colonies being what they are, as Norman Stone was observed, roughly equaling the whites. It's, oh my gosh, another restriction. Just keep me on restriction if you don't like me. Simple as that. As Norman Stone was observed, roughly equaling the whites. It was all quite understandable. By 1790, Haiti was perhaps the most productive colony in modern world had known. Its sugar, coffee, indigo, and tobacco production was said to be greater than the total of British North America. And what the British Caribbean had done for their economies in Bristol, Manchester, and the Saint Domingo, did the Nantes, Bordeaux, Marseille, Orleans, Dapie, Barcy, Paris, and another, quote, dozen great towns. C.L.R. James commented, here's C.L.R. James, it received in its ports 1,587 ships, a greater number of Marseilles, a great number than Marseilles, and France used for the San Domingo trade along 750 great vessels, employing 24,000 sailors. And in 1789, Britain's export trade would be 27 million pounds. That of France, 17 million pounds, in which the trade in San Domingo would account for nearly 11 million pounds. The whole of Britain's colonial trade in that year amounted to only 5 million pounds. And all of it rested on slavery, black people, and food for the black people. That is the one rule for the colonies. A French economist of the late 18th century declared Haiti's slave population, however, was not self-reproducing, and even so severe as phobia against black people. They use the N-word phobia. A Lothrop, Stoddard, that's a name, had to admit to the reasons why, sandwiched between the invocation of the official rationalization for the persistent destruction of the black population, explanations that ranged from the truths of improper food, the exploitation of pregnant women, high infant mortality, and venereal disease, to the absurdities of proposing the nervous strain. On, quote, the S word suddenly, I get it, stop telling me, I don't get it. The S word suddenly introduced the continuous labor and supposition of an analogy, right?
Yes, analogy.
Yeah, to impact the captivity of the reproductive capacity of wild animals. Stoddard was uncoupled to acknowledge, quote, the general opinion seems to have been that black people were worked too hard, and that this was often deliberately done, as many masters considered it cheaper to buy slaves than to breed them. As a consequence, the colony had forced to import Africans at a rate which, by the time of the Revolution, had grown to at least 40,000 each year. In turn, Stoddard recognized, quote, one of the most important considerations for the history of the revolution in San Domingo is the fact that the majority of the black population was African born.
That was a lot of people. Okay, that was it.
231. Remember 231 real quick?
Okay. Hey, carrot cake.
Okay, good. We'll be fine. 231.
Okay.
So I say 232 or 231?
231.
Okay. In the second slave era, when Haiti had ultimately recapitulated some of the phenomenology of its first, its slave system was cruel and genocidal. Its master class made up its destitute aristocrat, and others just as desperate to achieve the wealth and titles of noble status. Its laboring class, increasingly African, and its whites differentiated between the few of who succeeded and then absented themselves, and the many whose only achievement was a minor functionaries. One other such reoccurrence was maroonage. Stoddard, in typical fashion, commented, "There was always a minority of untamable spirits who burst their bonds and sought an outlaw's freedom. In the mountainous country like San Domingo, this was easy, and soon every tract of forest and jungle came to have its wild denizens. Denizens, thank you. As time went on, the number of Maroons steadily increased. During the year 1720 alone, over 1,000 black people took to the woods, while in 1751, a high official estimate of refugees in the mountains of the Spanish border at over 3,000. Wild outlawries was the most respect that the scholars in tradition joined by Stoddard could accord to the Maroons. Despite repeating efforts to destroy the communities, they persisted, however, devastating the countryside and in inspiring fear in the Santo Domingo settlers. At the end of the 18th century, others like the framed La Manuel made their peace with the colonial authorities only on the very eve of the revolution that would eventually make them redundant. Yet their importance, the significance they bore for the ideologists of the colonial regime, went far beyond their objective achievements. Like the revolution, their existence foretold. They were demeaned and devalued by those who saw in them a contradiction to the myths of European superiority. The precise that is historical relationship of the Maroons to the Haitian Revolution is still a matter of debate, particularly so among Haitians historians. Some traditions hold that the Maroons played no role in the revolution at all. Others declare that the Maroons were, quote, principal origin of the rising of 1791. If it were not Haiti, about which the controversy revolved, the debate might have very well been settled by available evidence. After all, voodoo, which James terms, quote, the medium of the conspiracy of 1791, was also inspired earlier Maroon revolts, and most important of which had occurred barely 13 years before under the guide of, Macandel. Two of the revolution's first leaders were Maroons: Boukman, a fugitive slave from Jamaica, and Jean Francisco, who had spent the last few years prior to 1791 as a Maroon, and as well when in late August, biracial peoples of the Western Province too rose up against the French. We know that they enlisted Maroons, whom they termed, quote, the Swiss, and whom they would eventually betray. The Maroons The Maroons, it would seem, were an integral part to the desperate elements that crystallized into the Haitian Revolution, but they had been party to the genesis of a pariah nation, the Black Republic that, in the first years of the 19th century, threatened the slave society that were its neighbors and confounded the heirs to more recent racial ideology. Haitian Maroons were part of the unacceptable entity. Their history and their historical character had become pawns, objects of contest between Haitian ideologues representing that David Nicholas called, quote, the black and biracial legends of the past, and related to the diminution of the revolution itself by European and American historians and scholars. Division among the whites, the population structure, the international situation. These are all factors which must be taken into account when we attempt to explain the course of events leading up to Haitian independence. To include from this that black slave population played a merely passive role in the revolution would be seriously misperceive the situation. Perhaps we may accuse the anthropologist Liburn for a somewhat naive approach to the past when he suggests that, quote, it was not the resettlement of slaves against their masters which caused the final explosion. The slaves were tender use by others to keep the conflagration burning. Less innocent, however, is T.O. Ott in his explicitly historical work, The Haitian Revolution. The author clearly sees that, quote, there was no monolithic cause of the slave rebellion, end quote. Yet he commits himself to an extraordinary view that the whites and biracial people, quote, handed them, the slaves, the colony by default, end quote, and, quote, forced them into a course of action which they would not otherwise be adopted. Less comfortable with the dialectic that James employed so effectively in his study of the revolution, in which he will explore in part 3. Nicholas concluded, quote, the movement succeeded because of its structural relationship to the global situation, but this is not to say that the slaves were merely passive, end quote. We should know, though, that Nicholas tempered criticisms are of the milder and more recent expression of the academic tradition, some of whose elements appear as early as October 1791. And among the contributors were those of whom James declared in 1938 constitute the venal race of scholars, profiteering panders to national vanity, who of the conspired is to obscure the truth. The truth of the Haitian Revolution, however, was not long in doubt in slave society as the other West Caribbean and the Americas of the late 18th and early 19th century. For 13 years, they were all, the master fearfully, the slaves expectantly witnessed the struggles between slave armies and the forces of British, French, France, Britain, Spain, and then France again. They heard some versions of a gigantic bookman, the Papelots, whose plan for the massive revolt had been constructed in the early months of 1791 and revealed to the authorities by the absorptive uprising of the slave in Lampi in early August. They understood how the racial arrogance of the colonies had deceived them into delay, deflecting their attention to the Petites Blancas rambles of Le Cap Francisco, whose greed masked as revolutionary ideals had to be behind any slave insurrection with this reported scale. They were fascinated by the details of the night of lightning, wind, and rain. 22nd August, when Boukman called together the slave of the Turpin, Flainville, Clement, Tremes, and Neil plantations of the northern plain. And they began to mass distinction of the objects of their oppression. They heard how quickly the rebellion had spread. Suddenly, it seemed 100,000 angry black people in the North Providence alone had swept the plain clean of its century-old vestige of slavery. In the West Providence, biracial forces had joined the revolution, and when it was propitious for them, betrayed it. Their treason to the insurgents was short-lived, and their promised reward not forthcoming. They would rejoin the revolution and betray it again. By late September, Boukman was dead, and so were his comrades, Gillies and John Baptiste. But the slaves were now transformed into black armies, marching into battle, quote, to African martial music, material music, and with unfurled
military music.
Yeah. Banners inscribed with "Death to all whites." For the moment, on and grand historical parade of the Haitian Revolution proceeded. The witnesses learned the name of Toussaint Louverture, an ex-slave who had acquired slaves of his own before joining and then becoming the first overall commander of the Black Revolution. Dessalines, the slave whose military genius and hatred of the whites would knit the movement back together again when it was wounded by Napoleon's treacherous betrayal of Toussaint and propelled it towards new revolutionary heights. Henry Christophe, the slave whose old intimacy with Cap Francisco society would seduce him into becoming emperor of Haiti, matching his station with the much grander presence of Napoleon. And perhaps if they were very attentive, they came to know other leaders like Mosey, Janot, Jean Francisco, and the French Republic, Sonothax, and heard, no doubt, with due what's that? Anonymity?
Anonymity.
Say it again. Anonymity.
Anonymity.
Anonymity, yes. Of the mysterious achievements of men like Hyacinth. Yeah, I said it. I know what it is. I just can't say it right. The slaves of Haiti were no way passive recipients. Haiti burned the ears of the slave owners in the New World at the beginning of the 19th century. They whispered its name, futilely. What's that word?
Futilely.
Yeah, futilely, conspiring to deny its legend and its very existence to their properties. But it was their ideologues, their intellectuals, their academies that succeeded in the larger suppression of the fact. Their weaponry was ridiculed, while those of the bourgeoisie masters were economic and diplomatic strangulation. And in this century, in the due course, when the memory of the revolt had faded among most of the descendants of the masters of slave classes and the old and new worlds, the still classic and unsurpassed studies of the revolution by James appeared. Thus, for the moment, it is appropriate that we should have the last word of that revolution of slaves. James summed up his reconstruction of what had happened in Haiti. No one could have guessed the power that was born in them when Boukman gave the signal for revolt on that stormy August night in 1791, rebellion, war, peace, economic organization, international diplomacy, administration. They had shown their capacity. The national struggle against Bonaparte in Spain, the burning of Moscow by the Russians that fills the histories of the period. We anticipated we anticipated and excelled by black people and biracial people of the island of San Domingo. The records are there for self-sacrifice and heroism. The men, women, and children who drove out the French stand second to no fighters for independence in any place or time. And the reason was simple. They had seen at last that without independence, they could not maintain their liberty. But even before this black rebellion was resolved, its impact was being felt elsewhere. From Haiti, the revolution extended to Louisiana in 1795, Virginia in 1800, and Louisiana again in 1811. Quite recently, Eugene Gonoves has remarked, Gabriel Processor in 1800 and Denmark Vesey in 1822 cautiously looked to Haiti for inspiration and support. And as late as 1840, slaves in South Carolina were interpreting news from Haiti as a harbinger of their own liberation. The slaveholders understood the potential of what they saw. References to the example of inspiration of Haiti reverberated across Black America. The impact of David Walker may be readily seen from his great appeal. And the slaveholders were not amused by celebrations of Haitian independence, such as the stage of 1859 of free Black Masons in St. Louis, Missouri, a slave state. The revolution in Saint Domingue propelled the revolution in Black consciousness throughout the New World. From Haiti and the, quote, one great militia, which Du Bois and Genoves claimed the white South constituted, the revolutionary tradition lit up the horizon of Brazil, Bajan region. From 1807 to 1835, the chronicler of Baha'i recorded revolts after revolt, 1807, 1809, 1813, 1816, 1826, 1827, 1830, and the Great Hassan Revolt of 1835. And again, it is the works of Nina Rodriguez, Artur Ramos, and more recently, R.K. Kent and Stuart Schultz, not always in agreement, that formed the instrument for both the recovery and the reconstruction of these events. And we'll stop there and we'll end Black Brazil and Resistance.
That was a great read. And I kind of like what he says, but like I know a lot of people are going to be like, "Yar." But
why would they be yar?
Because they would say the USSR, the war between the Mensheviks would be bigger. But I think the slave revolt that became a war in Haiti is better fighting.
Okay.
I agree with the author. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
Stuff down. So that way I can remember where we stopped at.
What page did we stop at?
235.
235?
Yep.
And Chicken says, you have anything going on tonight?
No, the only thing I have going on tonight, I have a meeting. I have a meeting at 9:30 again. I don't know how long it's going to be. It's coaching, I guess. So I'm sorry. If you have to, go ahead and do it tonight. I'll just come in when I can get a chance. I don't want to stop anybody from progressing and learning more. So it's up to you guys. It's up to you guys.
I'm not part of the reading. I'm reading it on our own still. We have our own little reading group.
Okay. But yeah, I'll join as soon as I'm done with the meeting. I think we're meeting at. Let me make sure. I'm gonna make sure. Hold on.
Doesn't mean I don't love you, chicken. I still love you.